In this video, I'd like to talk about Chapter 2 of the book State of Exception from 2005 by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. This chapter has a rather curious title. It's called Force of Law, but with the word law crossed out. And we'll be trying to investigate why Agamben is so interested in this expression and what it means for the state of exception or the state of emergency. Now, the chapter begins with a distinction that was made by the German critic Carl Schmitt, and it's a distinction between commissarial dictatorship and sovereign dictatorship. The idea with commissarial dictatorship is that this is a kind of caretaker government. Okay, so a caretaker government. In other words, when the government declares a state of emergency, it does so using provisions that are within the law. And when there is a state of emergency, the norms basically still remain in force. So the norms remain in force, and by norms we mean laws. Okay, so they remain in force, but the concrete application of the law is suspended. So we'll say, but the law, or the application of the law is suspended. So we're not actually applying the law, even though it technically does remain in force. And as we go on, this distinction between norms and their application will be really critical. Carl Schmitt isn't entirely satisfied with this first model, in part because it doesn't suggest that the sovereign has very much power, especially to do new things, for instance, to create a new constitution or to change the law. So in his other model of sovereign dictatorship in this case, the sovereign's position within this framework is very important. The sovereign is both inside and outside the juridical order. So we can say that the sovereign on the one hand belongs to it, right, is part of it, and on the other hand we have this element of ecstasy, which, going back to the Greek, ecstasis literally means standing outside of. The notion then is that the sovereign has to be in part outside the law, otherwise the sovereign would simply be ruled by the law and would have no freedom to change the law. And if you go back to Roman times, the expression that was often used for this was that the sovereign is legibus solutus, so free from the law. Okay, so legibus solutus, which, if I remember correctly, Agamben refers to elsewhere in the book. If the sovereign then is outside the law and yet part of it, then the law may also involve an element of decision making. And we can actually think of this as a kind of spectrum where there is more deciding that has to happen the further away we are from simply applying the norm as it is. Okay? So if we are simply applying the law and there's not much thought to it, then we just put it in practice, and that's easy enough. But there are cases where we have to make decisions, particularly when it comes to the state of exception, which we can kind of place on the side here. As you remember from the first video, sovereign is he, according to Carl Schmitt, who decides on the state of exception. So this element of decision then is very important. But Carl Schmitt's work here, what he really tries to do is to include the decision within the juridical order. And that makes the state of exception kind of more part of the legal framework as opposed to being entirely or mostly outside of it. This notion of decision then relates to two kinds of power that Carl Schmitt talks about. And these are constituent and constituted power. So constituent or founding power, okay, founding power versus constituted power. If you are only applying the law, then you might have constituted power. In other words, power has been granted to you, but you are not really using the power to do anything new. You're not constituting something. You're not founding something or creating something. And for Carl Schmitt, the sovereign should have a kind of founding power to make decisions to do things that are new, right? And that also may involve suspending the Constitution entirely and ruling potentially without it and putting new laws in place. So if that's the case, then we can say that within this kind of state of exception, the Constitution is entirely suspended. The Constitution is entirely suspended. All right. We can also add then that within this framework, the actions of the executive often work as if they have the force of law. Okay, so in this kind of context, actions start to accrue a kind of value. So actions have the force of law. The force of law. It's like they have this kind of legal aura to them, even though they might be kind of replacing the traditional constitution. And this is the contrast that we're really interested in, this notion that here the norms remain in force, and here increasingly actions have this kind of force of law. So to understand that in more detail, this notion that application is very difficult and is different from the norm, I'd like to next have a look at the notion of language, and this is what Agamben does as well. So in this case, he's talking about application as opposed to the norm, and he does it by looking at language, particularly semiotics, which is the study of signs. Okay, so semiotics, as well as a branch of semiotics which we might call semantics, or the study of meaning. All right. Within this field, then, there are two ways of looking at language. On the one hand, we have what's called parole, okay? And on the other hand, we have langue, and these are obviously both French words. They come to us from the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure from his course in general linguistics from 1916. The basic distinction is that parole is a kind of speech, although we should also include writing within this. It's actual speech in our everyday circumstances, whereas langue has to do more with the rules of the language, which are more abstracted. And you can find those rules in things like grammar books and dictionaries. We can think then about this relationship as a type of application. We can apply the rules to our actual discourse. And in that sense, it's not that dissimilar, according to Agamben, from the state of exception where we have reality and application on the one hand. Okay, we're applying the law, even though it's suspended, or we're making new laws. And on the other hand, we have the norms, or the law. So this relationship is quite similar, from norms to application, and from langue to parole. According to Agamben, similar things also happen in terms of what is suspended. If we think first of all of langue, we have a kind of suspension of application. So in order to create the rules, we can't look at every exception and we can't look at every nitty-gritty detail of what happens in actual speech, but we're going to suspend application in order to create some kind of abstraction of what the rule is. Similarly, if we think of parole, then what often happens is there's a kind of breaking of the rules, right? We break the rules in order to create meaning. And you can now see that semantics here has to do more with parole, with making meaning within the context of reality, and semiotics obviously affects the whole field, but also has to do with langue in terms of the sign systems we create in order to make meaning. Now, this sounds like an interesting analogy, that the state of exception can be similar to the way language works, that in both cases there's a breaking of the rules and a suspension of application. But there's one particular detail that Agamben wants to draw our attention to, and this is a certain type of sign that we have within the language. So the type of sign that he's interested in is what we call a floating signifier. Okay, so a floating, also an empty, that's another word for it, an empty signifier. There we go. So let's give an example here. Let's think of a sign or a signifier. Okay, and we'll take the concept of hope in this case. Now, what does hope really mean? What does it refer to? Think about reality, right? Like if we apply this to reality, can we think of what's called a referent? So a referent. And usually when we use a word, we like it to refer to something in the real world. Like if I talk about Joan, let's say I have a friend named Joan, okay, then presumably there's a real person out there whose name is Joan, and that's what that word is going to refer to in my case. But what does hope refer to? That's a more ambiguous concept, isn't it? What does that refer to? So this word, it seems like it can have many different meanings for different people. So if we think of different meanings here, then we can call these the signified. This is the signifier. There we go. We can have multiple signifieds or meanings. We can have meaning A. We can have meaning B, C, and so on and so forth. If you think back to President Obama and his talk about the audacity of hope, right? The hope that he would give to the American nation, that concept of hope can mean different things to many different people. And that's a very famous example. But there are other examples of floating signifiers that you could add. Concepts like liberty, race, fat, the American flag, manna. The list goes on. These are concepts which seem to have no meaning in a sense, or they have too many meanings. And we can talk then about an excess of signification, right? There's just way too many meanings that simply go on. Okay, well, let's add one more floating signifier to the mix here, and this is the expression force of law. So force of law. What does it mean? Okay. First of all, we can say that in relation to its referent, which presumably should be something like the law, okay, the law, there is a kind of suspension, isn't there? So the law should have the force of law, which would make sense. But just as in the case of hope, there is no application, no obvious application anyways, right? So in the same way, with force of law, we're kind of saying, well, in the state of exception, if we suspend the law, right, if we kind of put a cross through it, well, what happens then? And it seems that it releases all these new meanings. So we can have these new meanings of what force of law actually could be. And one of these is the notion that other things can start to have the force of law. So in other words, actions that a government may take can function as if they have the force of law. It's like this release of meaning. Or another way to think about it is that the floating signifier is a little bit like a balloon, right? So if you take a balloon, there we go, whoop. It's a bit of a funny balloon, and you tie it to something, it's going to stay in place. But then if you take away the cord, or you release it into the atmosphere, it's going to float away, and there it is. And now other things can kind of grab onto that balloon and say, hey, this is mine. And that's essentially what happens with this concept of force of law. The result then is that we can actually have two types of force of law. And I'm spending a lot of time on this because I really want to spell this out for you in terms of how this operates. So we can say then that basically there are two types of force of law. On the one hand, we have the regular force of law, as we saw before, when the law is in place. But then in a commissarial dictatorship, as we saw, there's no application. Okay, so we're not applying it, but we're not really doing away with a law either. It's kind of there by itself. The second type is where we basically have application, right? Application, which has the force of law, All right. So this notion of application then is super important, and we can start to see that it takes on this quality of having the aura of the law. Here too, we can go back to Roman law, and Agamben points out a number of different kind of legal maxims from the Roman period, such as that the sovereign within Roman law could act in a way that his actions have the force of law. Okay, but there are other maxims that Agamben refers to as well. What we can say then is that application within the state of exception is very complex. And to really make this point, Agamben concludes the chapter by making us think about how application happens not just within a legal context, but in many other spheres as well. So let's think about this concept of application a little bit more then. So think about, for instance, a general rule, which we assume has some kind of relationship to a particular case, or we could say a particular example. And often we think of this as a very straightforward kind of relationship. Like if I, for instance, say, well, there's a concept of tree, and I'm simplifying this a bit, but a concept of tree, then you could say, okay, well, an oak might be a particular example of that. And we can go in both ways. If I give an example of a tree, let's say a birch, then you might say, oh yeah, that's an example of a tree. And for us, this relationship seems super straightforward, not very complicated. And we might say then that this is a very logical operation, this kind of back and forth movement, right? Logical operation. But Agamben points out that it's not always as easy as that. It's not as if every example goes together with a general rule in this straightforward manner. And he argues that even if we go back to Immanuel Kant, who kind of talked about this in great detail, even there it wasn't the easiest operation. In fact, often it's not so much a matter of logic as a matter of praxis, or putting things through a difficult process and being pragmatic and really thinking through things and being practical. So if we think back to our earlier distinction, we talked about long, right? So we'll put that at the top here as similar to the general rule. And then we moved to parole. Well, within parole, we might say there's a process of speaking and enunciating. So enunciation, making meaning, okay, enunciation. And this is much more of a practical kind of process. It's not as easy as it seems. So it's a practical process where we take the rules and we put them into practice. We can also add to this another one, of course, and this is within the legal context. We are moving from a law or a norm to a case. And when we do that, there's often a trial involved. So if there's a particular legal case, we have to put somebody on trial and figure out how the evidence applies. Well, here you can really start to see that even though there's logic involved, there's also a great deal of argument and going back and forth, and it's not an easy process. It's not as if it's simply moving from an oak to a tree, right? It's a much more difficult thing. People can argue opposing views, and the judge has a really hard time determining whether or how the law applies and what the sentence should be. So in that instance, we don't have an enunciation as the final result, but we have a sentence, okay, some kind of legal sentence. But in order to get to this sentence, we kind of have to separate the norm and the application, right? Because we have to take the law and say, okay, I know what the law is, but this case doesn't quite fit it and it's not easy. And so I'm going to separate the law from its application in order to kind of come to some kind of application that's fair to this particular case. And we can take this logic and we can see it elsewhere too. So if we think, for instance, of something like reading the Bible, right? So there's the Bible, which can be a general rule for one's life. And then I have to apply it to myself, personal application. We might think, well, this is a really easy process. It's pretty clear what the Bible says. But Agamben suggests, well, no, it's not easy. As you can see, there are many Christians who have very different understandings of the Bible, and this requires interpretation. And what we see then is that we might have this perception that it's all simply about logic and it's an easy operation, but increasingly we see this practical side, this trial element, this interpretive element, where each case basically, every specific, as we think about this, right, every specific has an element of the exception. There's an exceptional quality to this. So every case is exceptional at some level, where it doesn't quite fit the rule. And this is the critical thing then. You can now start to see that for Agamben, the state of exception is not just a legal thing, it's everywhere. The state of exception happens within all these different domains. And the irony then is that the state of exception becomes the norm, right? It's not exceptional, it's normal to have this kind of state of exception. Every type of interpretation involves some kind of application where part of the norm at least has to be ignored in order for the application to actually function properly. Hopefully that helps you make sense of how Chapter 2 sheds some new light on the state of exception.